The morning of the negotiation began with an energy that felt almost ceremonial. The building's lobby gleamed with polished marble, and even the usually indifferent receptionists whispered about the magnitude of what was about to unfold. A potential partnership worth $180 million was not a simple transaction. It was the kind of deal that redefined careers, secured legacies, and created headlines powerful enough to move markets. Executives arrived dressed in suits that cost more than some people's salaries, their shoes reflecting the ceiling lights like mirrors. They carried folders embossed with the company's logo, as though the symbolism alone could guarantee success. Every detail had been rehearsed, every statistic had been memorized, and every handshake had been practiced until it looked natural. I stood unnoticed near the back wall of the conference room, my position so unimportant that no one even questioned my presence. I had no title worthy of attention, no authority to influence decisions, and certainly no seat at the enormous oval table dominating the room. In a hierarchy built on ego, I existed below the floorboards. My only possession that morning was a notebook I held out of habit rather than utility. No one had asked me to bring it, and no one cared if I did. Yet, as I watched everyone scramble, I sensed something brewing beneath the surface, a truth hidden behind confident smiles and hollow assurances. The Japanese delegation had not yet arrived, but anxiety seeped through the air like humidity before a storm. Consultants leaned toward each other, whispering predictions of what the press might write once the deal was signed. Investors paced nervously near the windows overlooking the city skyline, occasionally glancing at their watches as if that would speed up time. Every person in that room was convinced they were on the brink of history, and in a way, they were just not the history they expected. Then the CEO arrived. He entered with a theatrical confidence that demanded attention. His custom-tailored suit hugged his frame like armor, and his platinum pen gleamed in his breast pocket like a miniature trophy. He moved with the exaggerated casualness of someone who had mistaken arrogance for charisma. His assistants followed behind him, carrying a laptop, 3 binders, and a tablet, as though he were preparing for war rather than negotiation. He paused near the table, surveyed the room with a smirk that felt more like a verdict than a greeting, and then his eyes landed on me. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't inquire about my role. He didn't acknowledge me as a professional with a purpose. He simply saw a body he believed existed for his convenience. His voice sliced through the conversations as he tapped the edge of the table with his pen. The sound echoed, sharp and deliberate, drawing every gaze toward him. He raised his chin and pointed directly at me. "You fetch coffee," he said, making sure his tone dripped with condescension. "Leave the thinking to adults." The laughter that followed didn't erupt, it cascaded. Executives chuckled behind their papers. Investors smirked as though cruelty was proof of leadership. Even employees who knew better chose silence, because silence was safer than integrity. The humiliation settled on my shoulders like a mantle I had not earned but was forced to wear. For a moment, I wondered if this was how invisible people felt every day, present but erased. Yet humiliation does something remarkable. It either destroys a person or awakens them. I nodded without responding and walked toward the coffee machine stationed outside the room. I could feel the weight of their stares, not because they cared about what I did, but because my existence had become their morning entertainment. I poured the coffee slowly, giving myself time to breathe, to process, and to remind my heart not to react in anger. Anger reveals weakness. Patience conceals power. On my way back, I glanced through the glass wall separating the hallway from the conference room. The CEO was laughing loudly, his hands gesturing wildly as he reenacted his humiliation of me for those who had missed it. The joke had become a performance. The performance had become applause. And the applause had become the confirmation he needed to believe he was untouchable. He had no idea he had just insulted the only person in that room capable of understanding the language of their future partners. The Japanese delegation arrived moments later. They entered quietly, bowing slightly as a gesture of respect. Their suits were less flamboyant, their movements more deliberate, and their eyes sharper than anyone realized. They were not captivated by theatrics, they were attentive to details. The CEO flashed an overly enthusiastic smile, extending his hand too quickly, misjudging the cultural pacing. The lead negotiator hesitated before shaking it, a pause subtle enough to be missed by anyone unfamiliar with Japanese customs, but obvious enough to signal discomfort to someone who had lived there. That someone was me. While everyone else scrambled to adjust projectors, organize documents, and prepare rehearsed speeches, my attention fixed on the conversations happening in the language no one expected to understand. The delegates exchanged quiet observations, noting how unprepared the team seemed, how the CEO appeared more concerned with attention than alignment, and how disrespectful it was to treat any staff member, regardless of rank, as inferior. Their words were not accusations. They were assessments. In Japan, trust precedes business and respect precedes negotiation. The CEO had already failed the exam before the test had begun. As the meeting proceeded, the CEO dominated the conversation, speaking loudly, interrupting translators, and showcasing charts as though numbers alone could force credibility. The investors applauded every phrase he uttered, and the executives nodded with the enthusiasm of well-trained marionettes. Meanwhile, the Japanese negotiators remained composed but distant, whispering among themselves in short, precise sentences. Their expressions revealed nothing, but their tone unveiled everything. They were not impressed. I stood motionless, coffee tray still in hand, listening to each remark they made. They questioned the authenticity of the projected numbers, the unrealistic timelines, and the absence of humility. One delegate quietly asked another if arrogance was a cultural expectation here or merely a reflection of this particular leadership. Another replied that a company unable to respect its own employees would certainly fail to honor a foreign partner. Their words burned into me, not because they were wrong, but because they were devastatingly accurate. The CEO believed leadership meant dominance. The Japanese delegates believed leadership meant responsibility. It was not a difference in opinion, it was a difference in worldview. As I placed the coffee next to the CEO, he didn't thank me. He didn't acknowledge me. He simply waved me away as though my mere presence threatened his spotlight. That small gesture, so insignificant in action yet monumental in meaning, crystallized something inside me. It was not merely humiliation. It was revelation. The CEO had not insulted an employee. He had insulted a bridge. He had dismissed a link between cultures. He had ridiculed the one person capable of understanding the subtle nuances that could make or break a multinational agreement. He assumed the world spoke his language. He assumed power protected him from consequences. He assumed silence meant weakness. He was wrong. I felt the humiliation transform into something sharper clarity. I had spent 8 years living in Osaka, mastering the language, absorbing the etiquette, learning the difference between agreement and acceptance. In Japan, deals are not closed through persuasion, they are closed through respect. The CEO believed numbers gave him leverage. He never realized that attitude had already bankrupted him. As the morning continued, the laughter died, replaced by tension no one could explain. People sensed something shifting, but they could not identify the source. They assumed the deal's complexity caused the unease. They blamed jet lag, cultural differences, and high expectations. They never once considered that the smallest, most underestimated person in the room held the truth they desperately needed. I said nothing. I waited. And in that waiting, a decision shaped itself like a sword being forged in silence. The CEO thought he had reduced me to an errand boy. What he did, without knowing, was grant me a vantage point, one where I could see his downfall forming, one word at a time. And all it took was coffee. The conference screen flickered to life with a loud hum that might have warned a more attentive leader, but our CEO interpreted it as a triumphal fanfare. He clicked through slides with exaggerated confidence, convinced that a barrage of graphs and projected earnings would mesmerize the Japanese delegation into compliance. The visuals showcased aggressive growth models and inflated valuations, each point punctuated by buzzwords meant to sound visionary. Yet for anyone who understood the nuances of international business, especially Japanese corporate culture, those presentations were less strategic analysis and more reckless optimism wrapped in digital flash. The first chart displayed a revenue curve that rose like a rocket with no explanation. The second provided profit margins that contradicted cost projections the team had reviewed only days earlier. Several numbers appeared in red, not as warnings but as assertions of dominance, accompanied by English catchphrases meant to inspire confidence. The Japanese executives stared at them with polite expressions, their nods more courteous than convinced. They exchanged brief glances that revealed more than any spoken word could. Their eyes reflected confusion, not clarity, caution, not confidence. The mistranslations began almost immediately. A slide titled Guaranteed Stability Market Growth was rendered in Japanese as something closer to permanent eternal rising of risk-free wealth, a phrase that sounded like it belonged to a gambler, not a corporation. Another slide intended to convey organic expansion through trust-based relationships appeared in Japanese as unrestricted invasion through customer submission. The errors were not minor variations. They were catastrophic misinterpretations that distorted intent into something predatory. Our CEO, oblivious to the subtleties, spoke faster as he moved through each presentation layer. He believed speed demonstrated intelligence. He believed noise signaled leadership. He never realized that in front of seasoned Japanese negotiators, haste equaled insecurity. His tone swelled with self-assurance, but each sentence collided with the delegation's silent doubts. Their lead negotiator, a man with decades marked in the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, scribbled notes with measured precision. His pen left no stroke wasted. His thoughts appeared as calm as still water, yet beneath that serenity, a current was forming. I stood unnoticed at the edge of the room, sipping the coffee I had been ordered to fetch, watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. The taste of the drink was bitter, but not nearly as bitter as the truth only I seemed to understand. Every mispronounced Japanese term, every misinterpreted proverb, and every culturally tone-deaf remark stacked like stones on a collapsing bridge. My colleagues mistook polite silence for approval. They believed the Japanese delegation's reserved demeanor signaled agreement. They could not see the disaster approaching because they expected applause where there was only evaluation. The CEO continued, boasting about projected market penetration strategies. He waved his hands dramatically, slicing the air as though conducting an orchestra. Behind him, the phrase strategic alliance through strength had been translated not as cooperation but as subjugation. Instead of building a bridge, he was erecting a wall, and brick by brick, the wall was pushing the delegation farther away. They whispered among themselves in Japanese, their voices soft enough to blend with the hum of the projector, certain that no one in the room could decipher their concerns. But I understood every syllable. They questioned not just the numbers, but the mentality. One executive noted that the CEO referred to their market as untapped territory, a phrase that, in Japanese culture, implied conquest rather than partnership. Another commented on how the CEO spoke over his own translators, a sign of disrespect that violated the foundational principle of harmony. Another wondered why no one in the room acknowledged the cultural difference between confidence and arrogance. Their questions were not emotional. They were structural. They were not deciding whether the deal was profitable. They were deciding whether we were trustworthy enough to be allies. The investors seated behind the CEO clapped sporadically, unaware that their applause was premature. They believed volume equaled persuasion. They believed charts compensated for humility. They believed money eliminated cultural barriers. They never realized that Japanese executives valued long-term relationships over immediate gains. Trust was currency. Respect was collateral. We offered neither. The consultants, brought in at extraordinary cost, shifted nervously as the delegation's whispers grew more frequent. They sensed something slipping yet lacked the insight to understand why. To them, negotiation had always been transactional: numbers, contracts, leverage. They did not understand the deeper mathematics of honor, patience, and cultural dignity. They did not see that every misplaced word, every exaggerated claim, and every dismissive gesture weakened the foundation of the agreement. The storm grew silently, invisible to those blinded by ambition. The CEO flipped to a slide claiming Japan's consumer market was vulnerable due to aging demographics, an observation presented with the insensitivity of a man who had never studied the audience he was addressing. To the delegation, the phrase translated into a direct insult, one that dismissed an entire population as weak rather than recognizing its purchasing power and brand loyalty. Whispers surged again. One delegate muttered that entering into business with someone who insulted their culture before signing paperwork was an omen of worse behavior after contracts were finalized. As the tensions mounted, the CEO announced a bold projection, a 35% market share within 18 months. The room erupted into quiet disbelief. Such optimism might impress domestic stakeholders, but to the Japanese delegation, it exposed naivety. Market penetration was not a race, it was a lineage. Success was not an explosion, it was a cultivation. They knew he had not studied their consumer patterns, business etiquette, or regulatory structure. They knew he did not respect time, and anyone who does not respect time cannot respect commitment. Still, the CEO remained oblivious, basking in the glow of his self-imposed spotlight. His confidence, once a strength, had become a liability. He laughed loudly at his own jokes, unaware that humor does not transcend cultures without context. He gestured wildly at the translator, interrupting him repeatedly, unaware that correction without invitation is a sign of immaturity in Japanese business custom. And he strutted around the room, assuming movement equaled authority, unaware that patience commands far more attention than performance. I continued to sip my coffee, each swallow a reminder of the insult that had started my clarity. I was not angry, I was observant. Anger clouds judgment. Observation sharpens it. I did not need a seat at the table. I had something far more valuable, a vantage point. From where I stood, I saw the cracks widening. I saw the delegation's shoulders stiffen. I saw the notes grow longer. I saw reputations crumble before signatures could dry. One delegate leaned toward another and asked a question that pierced deeper than any financial statistic. If they treat their staff like this publicly, how would they treat us privately? That was the moment I knew the deal was no longer fragile, it was broken. There was no coming back from a question that challenged character, not strategy. Yet the CEO smiled, oblivious, confident that printed slides and inflated projections would drown out. He mistook silence for surrender. He mistook nods for agreement. He mistook courtesy for compliance. He never realized that arrogance is loud, but dignity is quiet, and dignified people always leave quietly before the building collapses. I finished my coffee as the room shifted from anticipation to inevitability. The delegation remained calm. Their pens continued to move. Their eyes continued to observe. But the outcome had already been sealed in the phrases they believed were private. A failure was unfolding in plain sight, yet no one noticed. Except me. And that was the thing they didn't see. The sentence was not shouted. It was not delivered with malice. It was spoken with a calmness so profound it sliced through the noise of the conference room like a blade hidden inside silk. The lead negotiator, a slender elderly man with silver-streaked hair and a posture that demanded respect without asking for it, leaned toward his colleague and murmured in Japanese, "If they disrespect their own people, imagine how they'll treat us." That single observation struck me harder than the CEO's earlier humiliation. The insult about fetching coffee was personal, but this was structural. This was a diagnosis of the company's soul. In that brief whisper, he had not merely questioned our competence, he had exposed the ethical decay woven into our corporate culture. His tone was not accusatory. It was disappointed, like someone witnessing a promising student waste their potential. And for the first time since the morning began, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not humiliation, but responsibility. The weight of his words reverberated through my mind. They were not spoken loudly, yet they echoed louder than the CEO's laughter, louder than the applause of investors who mistook arrogance for strength, louder than the sound of my own heartbeat. Respect, in Japanese culture, was not a decorative word placed in a mission statement. It was the foundation of every relationship, every negotiation, every agreement. If that foundation cracked, nothing stood. I glanced around the room. The executives were engrossed in their own self-congratulation. The CEO strutted arrogantly near the giant screen, basking in the artificial spotlight he believed he deserved. Investors checked their phones, ignoring warning signs that would have terrified them had they understood them. The consultants, paralyzed by the arrogance they had been hired to enable, pretended everything was proceeding according to plan. Every person in that room held a title. And yet, the only people paying attention were the ones silently preparing to walk away. The lead negotiator's remark wasn't rhetorical. It was conclusive. It meant he had already rendered judgment. The question now was not whether the deal would fall apart, it was how loudly the collapse would echo across the financial world. I felt the bitterness of my coffee settle in my stomach like a stone. My humiliation no longer mattered. This was no longer about a man who wanted to degrade me to inflate his ego. This was about a company incapable of recognizing the difference between authority and leadership. This was about dignity, not mine alone, but the dignity of anyone who believed competence should be respected, not mocked. The realization struck me with painful clarity. My silence was protecting people who didn't deserve to be protected. Every second I remained quiet, every moment I stood in that corner pretending to be invisible, I was complicit. By hiding what I knew, by withholding the truth only I understood, I was helping them present a facade that would betray not only the Japanese delegation, but future employees, clients, and partners who trusted this organization. Silence, I realized, was not neutrality. Silence was endorsement. The CEO moved to another slide, filled with slogans that meant nothing but sounded expensive. The projection behind him proclaimed, "Our future is global," yet he could not demonstrate the most basic courtesy toward individuals from a foreign culture. He did not even notice that one of the Japanese delegates had stopped taking notes. Respect had left the room long before signatures could be exchanged. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup. Every instinct told me to stay quiet, to blend into the background, to keep my head down and protect my paycheck. But another force pushed back, stronger, older, rooted in something my parents taught me long before corporate etiquette ever entered my life. A person is measured not by what they say, but by what they tolerate. If I tolerated this, then I was no different from them. My thoughts raced. If I spoke up, I risked everything: my job, my reputation, my future. The CEO was the kind of leader who punished dissent. He did not debate criticism. He eliminated it. The executives worshipped him because he held the illusion of power. The HR department existed to protect him, not employees. If I corrected him publicly, I would be fired before my words even finished echoing. Yet another possibility lingered in my mind, hidden like an unopened envelope. What if the Japanese delegation cared enough to listen? What if the truth mattered more to them than hierarchy? What if they valued honesty over compliance? What if the person the company discarded was the only person they needed? I took another sip of coffee, though the taste had gone numb. My heartbeat slowed, not with calmness, but with acceptance. I understood now that I was standing at a crossroads, and the path I chose would follow me for the rest of my life. I looked again at the lead negotiator. His face was a portrait of composure, carved by years of navigating boardrooms where decisions shaped economies. He was not a man easily impressed by promises. He was a man who measured character before numbers. His whisper to his colleague had not been an emotional outburst, it was an executive verdict. They came seeking partnership. They found entitlement. The CEO clicked again. The next slide appeared, projected Japanese integration timeline. It listed actions and deadlines that insulted the very culture it claimed to embrace. The plan assumed immediate compliance, instant adaptation, automatic trust, concepts that contradicted Japanese business philosophy at its core. Here, relationships were earned slowly, like the careful brewing of tea. The CEO treated them like instant coffee. As he laughed at his own sense of cleverness, a memory surfaced unexpectedly: my first months in Osaka. I recalled sitting at a tiny restaurant near the Dotonbori Canal, struggling to understand conversations around me. Respect was not inserted into sentences, it was woven into tone, posture, cadence. I learned quickly that language was not just words, it was history. And no translation software could replicate that. Yet here we were, preparing to finalize a multi-million-dollar deal using mistranslated phrases and butchered idioms that made us look like conquistadors instead of partners. My pulse quickened. If I let this continue, I would betray not only the delegation but myself. Humiliation from the CEO was temporary. Complicity would be permanent. The realization crystallized into something immovable. If I did nothing, I would become part of their arrogance. If I spoke, I could either save the company or bury it. At that moment, I knew something irreversible. My silence was no longer cowardice. It was consent. And consent was no longer an option I could live with. The room vibrated with ignorance masquerading as confidence. The CEO declared that the Japanese market needed us more than we needed them, unaware that such a statement, translated directly, was a slap across centuries of cultural philosophy. The investors applauded. The translators hesitated. The delegation remained silent, not out of agreement, but out of respect for their own self-control. I watched it all, aware that the line between patience and regret was thin. I felt my hand loosen around the cup. The coffee was gone. The decision was not. I stepped back from the wall, no longer anchored to invisibility. My breath steadied. The storm I sensed earlier was no longer forming. It was here. And for the first time since the CEO dismissed me, I understood something powerful. I was not the weakest person in the room. I was the only one awake. The signing table had been polished to a mirror-like shine, as if the reflection of the pens placed upon it could somehow reinforce the illusion of certainty. A ceremonial document holder lay open before the Japanese delegation, the edges trimmed with gold, the pages pristine and heavy with legal authority. The CEO stood near the table like a monarch awaiting coronation, his smile stretched wide enough to crack. He believed everything was done, victory secured, history written, his legacy immortalized. Behind him, executives hovered like anxious satellites, whispering about press releases, photo opportunities, and the bonuses they were already mentally spending. The investors leaned forward in anticipation, their eyes glimmering with the greed of people who mistook optimism for destiny. Consultants positioned themselves for recognition, hoping their participation would become a credential embossed on their professional reputations. Every observer moved with the excitement of gamblers convinced they held a winning hand. What they did not realize was that the deck had already been exposed, and it was empty. The head translator approached the delegation with rehearsed grace and bowed slightly as he gestured toward the pen tray. The room hushed with collective expectation. The CEO inhaled deeply, preparing to deliver a breathless speech that had taken 3 assistants and an overpriced communication coach to construct. He did not see the fissures forming beneath the surface. He did not hear the quiet storm gathering behind him. He did not understand that history rarely announces itself. It waits for one sentence, one decision, one word to trigger an irreversible shift. That word was mine. Just as the delegation reached for their pens, I stepped forward. The sound of my shoes crossing the carpet was soft, yet to my ears it felt like thunder. My pulse hammered against my ribcage. Fear and clarity collided inside me, neither able to overpower the other. Someone near the table glanced up, surprised that I dared to move. The CEO noticed me a second later and reacted exactly as expected: contempt first, irritation second, fear nowhere in sight. He rolled his eyes with exaggerated annoyance, the kind reserved for people he considered beneath him. His voice sliced through the room. "Not now. Sit down." I did not sit. I did not retreat. I did not apologize. Instead, I walked past him. I reached the signing area, positioning myself not beside the executives who ignored me, nor behind the investors who underestimated me, but directly in front of the Japanese delegation. I could feel the CEO's outrage burning behind me like a furnace. He was accustomed to obedience. He was accustomed to control. He had never considered the possibility that someone he thought disposable might defy him. My heart pounded once more, but then something shifted. It was not courage. It was not rebellion. It was resolve. I bowed slightly, then raised my head and spoke in flawless native-level Japanese. "Before you sign anything, you deserve honesty. You are being misled." The effect was immediate. The entire room stopped breathing. Conversations that had been whispering along the edges of the moment evaporated. Someone's pen slipped from their fingers and struck the table with a dull metallic tick that echoed like a gunshot. The lead negotiator's eyes widened, not with offense, but with recognition. He did not know me, but he understood my language. He understood my intent. The CEO's face drained of color. His jaw tightened. His lips parted in disbelief before curling into something darker than anger-fear. For the first time, I was not invisible. Silence descended with a weight that collapsed every illusion of control. The executives who had laughed earlier now stared at me as though a ghost had materialized. The investors looked confused, searching for context. The consultants exchanged worried glances, realizing no training manual existed for this moment. The translator froze mid-step. His entire role had just become irrelevant. The lead negotiator leaned slightly forward, his posture shifting from observation to engagement. His eyes assessed me with an intensity that carried decades of experience. He nodded once, a silent invitation. I continued, still speaking Japanese, my tone respectful yet unwavering. There are errors in the documents you have been given. Numbers have been altered. Cultural terms have been misused. Assumptions have been made without understanding. This agreement is not based on transparency. It is based on arrogance. Several executives flinched as though I had physically struck them. The CEO snapped out of shock and lunged toward me, grabbing my arm. "You're done," he hissed. "Security will escort you out." His grip tightened, revealing the desperation behind his authority. He wanted control. He wanted silence. He wanted the illusion intact. What he did not understand was that illusions die the moment truth enters the room. The lead negotiator raised his hand, stopping the CEO with a gesture more powerful than any corporate mandate. The CEO hesitated, his instincts battling reality. Authority meant nothing without respect, and in that moment, he possessed neither. "Let him speak," the negotiator said, in English. The CEO released my arm reluctantly, his fingers trembling. He stepped back, unsure whether to shout, threaten, or pretend confidence. None of those options worked anymore. He had lost control, and everyone knew it. I faced the delegation, translating line by line how the projections presented were unattainable, how the translation errors had transformed partnership into disrespect, and how the CEO's remarks implied dominance rather than cooperation. I pointed out cultural misrepresentations, strategic inaccuracies, and clauses hidden behind technical language that shifted financial burdens unfairly onto the Japanese side. The delegation's expressions evolved from polite neutrality to stern recognition. They were not shocked by betrayal. Experienced negotiators anticipate it. They were shocked by honesty. Honesty in business was rare. Honesty from someone at the bottom of the hierarchy was nearly inconceivable. The CEO tried to interrupt, but the negotiator silenced him again, not with words, but with a look only powerful men fear. It was the expression of someone who had been underestimated one time too many. One delegate whispered, "So someone did understand." Another responded, "Yes." Someone was listening. Their acknowledgement was not applause. It was validation, a confirmation that respect still existed somewhere in this building, though not where it was expected. An investor finally broke his stupor. "What is happening? Can someone explain?" No one answered him. For the first time, explanations belonged to truth, not spin. The CEO attempted to regain control with bravado. "This employee is disgruntled. He is lying. He does not speak Japanese. He has no authority here." The lead negotiator responded calmly, in Japanese, "He speaks better than your presentation did." The room reacted as though struck by lightning. Investors panicked. Executives paled. Consultants shrank into their chairs. And the CEO, whose dominance had shaped this culture, suddenly looked very small. I bowed again, not triumphantly, but respectfully. "My goal is not to destroy this deal," I said. "My goal is to ensure you enter it with the truth you deserve." Whether they signed or not no longer depended on projections, translations, or promises. It depended on one question: was this a partnership or a deception? The negotiator turned to his colleagues. He spoke briefly, softly, efficiently. Their pens were no longer poised to sign. They were poised to reconsider. The energy in the room transformed. The certainty evaporated. The CEO had not lost a signature. He had lost trust. And trust cannot be negotiated back. I stood in silence, no longer holding coffee, no longer hiding behind obedience, no longer invisible. The room no longer revolved around the CEO. It revolved around truth. And truth had chosen me as its voice. The room, once buzzing with anticipation, had transformed into a silent courtroom whose walls waited for a verdict. The documents, once symbols of triumph, lay exposed like evidence at a crime scene. A moment ago, everyone was ready to celebrate. Now, no one dared inhale too loudly, afraid their breath might shift the fragile balance of what remained of the negotiation. I took a step forward, no longer the anonymous employee they dismissed, but the unexpected force they could not silence. The CEOs of companies often fear their rivals. They rarely fear the people they underestimate. Yet the look on my CEO's face was proof that he now understood something far too late. In business, power doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the quietest person who finally decides to speak. I placed my hand lightly on the stack of documents lying before the Japanese executives. The pages were crisp, heavy, filled with financial jargon crafted to dazzle the naive and confuse the cautious. But beneath the vocabulary and elegant formatting was something corrosive, deceit wrapped in ambition. I began to translate. The first clause I addressed concerned market expansion expenses. In English, it appeared harmless, simply noting shared responsibility for distribution fees. But in Japanese, the clause had been twisted into a commitment requiring the delegation's company to absorb infrastructure costs, warehousing, transportation, compliance fees, and consumer research for an entire region. It was not a partnership. It was a trap dressed as opportunity. The lead negotiator blinked twice, his stoic mask momentarily cracking. I moved to the next clause. Financial liability provisions that had been subtly relocated from our side of the balance sheet to theirs were buried under a maze of conditional statements. They were structured so that any regulatory stumble, currency fluctuation, or compliance delay would financially collapse the Japanese company while preserving our profits. One executive gasped softly. I turned to another section, a set of projections forecasting unprecedented market penetration. At first glance, the numbers promised explosive growth. But the foundations were fraudulent. The projections assumed a consumer adoption rate without acknowledging cultural barriers, regulatory limits, or competition. The board had manipulated the data by omitting risk coefficients, presenting speculation as certainty. I translated each manipulated phrase, revealing how our valuation was artificially inflated like a balloon waiting for the smallest needle. Someone's pen rolled off the table and hit the floor. No one reached to pick it up. The CEO lunged toward me then, grabbing my elbow so tightly I felt his nails through my sleeve. His voice, once dripping with arrogance, now trembled with desperation. "If you don't stop, you'll regret it," he hissed. "You're destroying everything." He was right, but not in the way he meant. I was not destroying the company. He had already done that the moment he decided deceit was cheaper than integrity. I was merely turning on the lights. I slipped my arm free and continued speaking, still in Japanese. My tone remained respectful, not because the CEO deserved it, but because the delegation did. Respect was not a gesture. It was a declaration of identity. The room leaned toward me, not physically, but intellectually. The executives who once ignored my existence now scrutinized every sentence. Investors who thought the deal was a golden ticket now looked like gamblers watching their final chip burn. Consultants who once applauded the CEO's bold projections now avoided his gaze, praying their names never appeared on the autopsy report this deal was becoming. I flipped to the final section of the agreement, the one no one but a linguist or a lawyer fluent in Japanese would notice. It was a clause hidden deep within the legal framework, one line that transferred responsibility for environmental and regulatory infractions to the Japanese side. If any scandal occurred, if any investigation arose, if any violation surfaced, they would bear the financial and reputational cost. In Japanese business culture, reputation is not currency. It is identity. Losing face is worse than losing money. To betray trust is to erase oneself. The lead negotiator's expression hardened. He took off his glasses and folded them carefully, a gesture that held more meaning than raised voices ever could. Another delegate whispered, "This was not a mistake." It wasn't. Mistakes are accidental. This was engineered. The CEO tried for one last performance. He spread his arms dramatically, his voice rising in pitch. "This employee has misunderstood everything. These translations are wrong. Our intent has always been partnership." Intent. The word hung in the air like smoke. Intent was exactly what I had exposed. Numbers can be corrected. Language can be revised. Intent cannot be hidden once seen. I looked at the delegation and translated the CEO's lie. I did not alter his tone. I gave them his words exactly as he intended. They recognized the difference immediately. Japanese executives listen not just to sentences, but to the values behind them. The CEO believed success justified deception. They believed deception eliminated the right to success. One of the delegates stood, his face composed yet resolute. He bowed respectfully, not to the CEO, but to me. "You protected us," he said in Japanese. "Your company did not." His words cut deeper than any accusation. The CEO flinched as though struck. The executives behind him looked horrified, not because the delegation was offended, but because the delegation now possessed something far more dangerous than anger, clarity. The lead negotiator rose next. He turned to his team, exchanged brief nods, and closed the agreement folder with both hands. The sound was quiet, deliberate, final, the corporate equivalent of a verdict. He addressed the room in English, his tone calm yet impossible to ignore. "In Japanese business culture," he said, "deceit is a death sentence. Respect is currency. You have offered neither." The silence that followed felt like eternity compressed into seconds. Investors shifted in their seats, suddenly aware that millions were evaporating in front of them. Consultants stared at the table, their professional futures crumbling. Executives who had laughed earlier now looked as though they were attending a funeral, because they were. A funeral for their credibility. The CEO opened his mouth, but words failed him. Without trust, speech is meaningless. Without respect, authority collapses. Without integrity, strategy is theater. The delegation bowed once more, this time as a farewell. Not a single pen touched paper. No signatures were made. The deal was dead. But the company didn't know it yet, not fully. It takes time for the heart to realize the brain has stopped functioning. I stood there, breathing steadily, no longer the errand boy they dismissed. The truth had not made me powerful. It had made them powerless. As the delegation exited, one of the younger executives paused beside me. "You did what leaders do," he whispered. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. In their culture, acknowledgement is earned, not requested. When they left the room, they took more than their signatures. They took the company's future. Deals can be rebuilt. Reputations rarely can. The CEO looked at me, no longer with contempt but with terror. He understood what he had lost, but he did not understand how he had lost it. Arrogance blinds people not to consequences, but to causes. The company had not gone bankrupt financially. It had gone bankrupt morally. And morality has a balance sheet of its own. The moment stretched like a taut thread, thin enough to break with the slightest tremor. The lead negotiator, an elder whose presence commanded more respect than any title on a business card, rose from his seat with measured grace. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, his silence heavier than the stacks of financial reports scattered across the table. Every eye locked onto him, breaths held hostage by anticipation. No one knew what he would say next, yet everyone sensed that whatever happened now would reshape everything they believed was secure. He bowed deeply, a gesture that carried centuries of culture, a gesture that meant far more than politeness. Then he lifted his head and spoke with a calmness that should have softened the impact, but instead amplified it beyond repair. "We do not invest where dignity is absent." The sentence did not echo, it detonated. Not through volume, but through clarity. It was not an accusation. It was a verdict. A final ruling delivered without anger, without theatrics, without arrogance. It was a scalpel of truth cutting straight through the inflated ego of a corporation that believed numbers could compensate for character. Every shareholder felt the oxygen leave the room. The consultants, who had rehearsed lines of corporate optimism, now looked like actors without scripts. The CEO's smile, which had been plastered to his face like cheap wallpaper, cracked. Investors stiffened. Executives who once chuckled at my insignificance now clung to armrests like passengers on a sinking ship. No one spoke. The negotiator's team mirrored his movement. They closed their folders in perfect unison, the sound crisp and final, like the shutting of a vault door, then slid their pens back into their pockets. The ceremonial tray that had once symbolized partnership now sat abandoned, its pens cold and unwanted, like weapons left behind on a battlefield where no war would be fought. They did not argue. They did not negotiate. They did not explain. They walked out. There was no shouting, no anger, no slammed doors. Only silence. But silence has tones. There is the silence of contemplation, the silence of hesitation, the silence of confusion. And then there is the silence that stalks balance sheets, the silence that drains capital faster than recessions, the silence that signals reputational death. This was that silence. The footsteps of the delegation were soft, but to the shareholders and executives in that room, they sounded like coffins closing. Each step down the hallway represented millions departing with them. Each quiet stride erased lines on a projected earnings report. The hallway lights reflected on their suits, and with every reflection, another illusion unraveled. The CEO tried to speak, but his vocal cords betrayed him. His mouth opened, yet nothing emerged. He reached for confidence and found none. His authority, so loud only minutes ago, had evaporated. He looked like a king suddenly aware his crown was purchased, not earned. A vice president whispered, "This can't be happening." But it was. Deals do not collapse because money is insufficient. Deals collapse when character is. No spreadsheet could reverse what had just been exposed. Another executive rose as if to chase the delegation, but his courage dissolved before his first step. What could he possibly say? That dignity would suddenly be respected? That deceit was a misunderstanding? That arrogance was temporary? Promises don't rebuild trust. Behavior does. And behavior had already been judged. The investors sank deeper into their chairs, calculating losses that had not yet materialized but were inevitable. Stocks do not fall when markets panic. They fall when confidence dissipates. Confidence had evaporated with one sentence, 5 words that weighed more than $180 million. The chief legal officer flipped pages frantically, searching for a clause that could force reconsideration. But business contracts cannot compel respect. No paragraph can mandate dignity. You cannot sue someone into trust. The CEO stumbled backward. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the table for support. He scanned the room, desperate for someone to defend him. No one did. Loyalty thrives in prosperity. It disappears when truth arrives. He tried a weak smile, as if pretending calm would resurrect authority. But his smile now resembled a crack in a dam. Behind his eyes, realization churned. He hadn't lost a deal. He had lost a reputation. And reputations, once shattered, do not recover. They calcify into cautionary tales. Then came the sound no executive wants to hear in a negotiation room, chairs moving backward. Not out of respect, not out of fear, but out of distance. People were physically separating themselves from the CEO, as though failure were contagious. They wanted no questions asked later about their role. They wanted plausible deniability. They wanted history to forget they applauded him. It was astonishing how quickly leaders become liabilities. The silent exit of the delegation had done something remarkable. It forced everyone to see the CEO not as a visionary, but as a liability wearing a suit. One of the investors leaned forward, his voice tremoring with disbelief. How did this happen? It was not a rhetorical question. It was a plea for explanation from a man accustomed to wins, not consequences. The room pivoted toward me. Not because I had authority, not because I sought attention, but because truth, once spoken, cannot be returned to silence. And I was the only one who possessed it. I did not step forward. I did not relish the moment. I simply stood with the composure of someone who has nothing left to fear. My humiliation was no longer relevant. I was no longer the employee who fetched coffee. I was the employee who detonated illusion. The CEO finally found his voice. "You have ruined everything," he spat at me. He tried to sound intimidating, but fear had already hollowed his tone. The words were less accusation than confession. I met his stare without blinking. "No," I said. I revealed everything. The distinction mattered. Destruction implies intent. Revelation implies inevitability. The truth had not attacked the company. It had simply shown up. The chief operations officer raised a trembling hand. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew this wasn't real." He wasn't asking about the projections. He wasn't asking about the clauses. He wasn't asking about the translations. He was asking about something deeper. "Did you know we were never worthy of this deal?" "Yes, but worthiness is not measured in revenue. It is measured in respect." Another vice president asked, "Why didn't you speak earlier?" "Because speaking earlier would have protected them. Speaking now protected dignity. Timing was not my weapon. Their behavior was." Behind me, the ceremonial signing tray glimmered in the overhead lights. Its gold trim now resembled irony. It was supposed to symbolize prestige. It now symbolized arrogance. In business, symbolism can elevate you or expose you. Today, it had done the latter. One board member, pale and visibly shaken, muttered, "This will be catastrophic." He was wrong. It already was. News would spread faster than damage control strategies could be drafted. Markets would interpret the delegation's exit before explanations reached shareholders. No press release could sanitize this. No spokesperson could massage the facts into comfort. Companies are not destroyed by mistakes. They are destroyed by the moment everyone realizes the mistake was not accidental. The CEO tried to salvage dignity. "We can still fix this," he insisted. But dignity cannot be stapled back into contracts. The room knew it. He knew it. I knew it. The delegation did not simply walk out of a negotiation. They walked out of a culture. Cultures do not recover easily. They must be rebuilt, not repaired. And rebuilding requires something this company never valued: humility. As the weight of consequence settled on every shoulder, I understood something profound. No leader ever loses a company in a single moment. They lose it one disregard at a time, one belittlement at a time, one missing apology at a time. The Japanese delegation did not destroy us. They diagnosed us. And diagnoses are only painful when the disease has been ignored for too long. The CEO collapsed back into his chair, looking not at me, but through me, as if searching for a version of reality where consequences were negotiable. They weren't. Not today. For the first time, fear replaced arrogance in his eyes. He saw something no power-hungry executive ever wants to see: the end. Not the end of a deal. The end of belief. And when belief dies, everything that depends on it dies with it. The collapse did not happen slowly. It did not arrive as a whisper or an internal memo buried beneath corporate jargon. It came like a storm that everyone saw too late, a tidal wave triggered not by economic instability or foreign policy, but by something far more dangerous: arrogance. By the time the Japanese delegation stepped out of the building, the consequences had already begun unraveling the company's carefully constructed facade. Within hours, emails poured in. At first, they were polite inquiries from board members who had not attended the meeting. They requested clarification, assuming there had been a misunderstanding. No one believed a deal of that magnitude could evaporate without warning. By the time the third email arrived, politeness had been replaced by urgency. Questions multiplied. Demands followed. The digital threads that once kept the company connected began to tighten around the CEO's neck like a noose woven from his own decisions. News travels quickly inside corporations, but it travels at the speed of light when investors catch the scent of disaster. Rumors leaped from office to office, corridor to corridor, server to server. Analysts who once praised the CEO's bold leadership were now scrolling through stock tickers with trembling hands. No one cared about his charisma anymore. Numbers had stopped behaving. The company's shares, once stable symbols of ambition, trembled as if anticipating impact. Then the press caught wind of the lost deal. It wasn't through an official announcement. It was through whispers, the kind financial journalists specialize in extracting, the kind that transforms speculation into headlines. One reporter tweeted that a major international partnership had dissolved unexpectedly. Another hinted at cultural misconduct at executive level. A third cited anonymous internal sources claiming strategic misrepresentation. Each tweet was a kindling spark. Together, they ignited a wildfire. By midday, financial news channels had seized the narrative. Commentators who once treated the CEO like a rock star now scrutinized his every public statement. Archived footage of his triumphant speeches played alongside new interviews with analysts, each one dissecting his strategy with the precision of a surgeon examining a tumor. The tone shifted from admiration to disbelief, then from disbelief to condemnation. Stocks did not just tremble, they plunged. Investors who once bragged about long-term positions liquidated shares with frantic speed. Some cited global instability. Others blamed market uncertainty. But behind every justification, one truth prevailed. No one invests in leaders who confuse arrogance with competence. The CEO attempted damage control. He issued a statement claiming the Japanese delegation had misunderstood the proposal due to translation discrepancies. But in the age of digital permanence, words do not vanish. They linger. They are recorded. They resurface. Recordings of his insults leaked. Someone no one knows who released the audio of him dismissing me and mocking the delegation's customs behind closed doors. His laughter, once a sign of dominance, now sounded like the cry of a man cornered by his own ego. The clip spread faster than any press release could counter. It played across financial news channels, dissected by body language experts, corporate psychologists, and cultural consultants who explained, in articulate detail, why the Japanese negotiators walked out. Suddenly, the man who laughed at me was not a visionary. He was a liability. For the first time in his tenure, his name was no longer synonymous with success. It was synonymous with failure and, worse, disrespect. Commentators repeated the negotiator's damning words, "We do not invest where dignity is absent." That sentence became a headline, then a meme, then a mantra. It appeared on social platforms, corporate forums, and investor newsletters. It became a warning, one that transcended the deal itself. It didn't just indict the CEO. It indicted the culture he created. HR opened investigations. When companies panic, they do not look outward, they turn inward. Human resources, once a silent arm of compliance, now brandished power like an axe. They reviewed internal complaints that had been ignored for years. Suddenly, employees found the courage to speak. Stories surfaced, not just about arrogance, but humiliation, condescension, and retaliation against those who dared to question leadership. Each testimony painted a portrait of the CEO not as a misguided strategist, but as a tyrant intoxicated by his own superiority. HR had ignored these claims before. Now they documented every word, hungry for absolution. Then legal stepped in. Legal departments are not emotional. They do not act out of outrage. They act out of instinct, an instinct sharpened by the scent of liability. Lawyers combed through contracts, minutes from board meetings, and communication logs. They searched not for mistakes, but for evidence of intent. Because in the world of corporate accountability, intent determines punishment. The more they searched, the more they uncovered. Altered clauses, missing disclosures, meetings without minutes, digital footprints of decisions made in arrogance rather than strategy. Legal departments do not crave blood, but once they smell it, they pursue it. Shareholders demanded answers. Their questions were no longer inquiries. They were ultimatums. They wanted to know how a CEO entrusted with global growth had sabotaged the company with a single cultural miscalculation. They wanted to understand why no one beneath him had spoken up. They demanded explanations for projections built on illusions, partnerships built on deceit, and valuations built on hope instead of humility. No one remembered the coffee. Not one person recalled the moment the CEO told me to fetch a beverage as though I were furniture. They did not remember the laughter that followed. They did not remember the humiliation. That moment was insignificant to them then, but now it was the origin point, a timestamp marking the beginning of a downfall. Arrogance blinds leaders not to failures, but to warnings. Everyone remembered the consequences. Consequences are louder than insults. They do not whisper. They roar. They appear in red numbers on stock tickers. They appear in headlines interpreting arrogance as incompetence. They appear in boardrooms where power evaporates faster than loyalty. Executives who once praised the CEO now distance themselves. They deleted messages, avoided eye contact, and rehearsed versions of events where they were innocent bystanders rather than accomplices. Some pretended they had never shared his beliefs. Others pretended they had warned him. Everyone became an actor auditioning for survival. The CEO called an emergency meeting. He stood before the team with a forced calmness, insisting that the company was strong, that the deal would be renegotiated, that volatility was temporary. But his eyes betrayed him. Confidence, once his most prized asset, now looked like desperation wearing a suit. He asked me to speak. He did not ask politely. He asked because he needed a shield. He had spent years silencing voices. Now he needed the one voice he tried to erase. But humility cannot be summoned like a meeting invite. Respect cannot be demanded after it has been denied. Leadership cannot be resurrected once it has been executed. I stood still. I did not nod. I did not speak. I did nothing. My silence was no longer complicity. My silence was accountability. He wanted redemption without repentance. He wanted forgiveness without consequence. He wanted to negotiate dignity as if it were a line item on a balance sheet. But dignity is not transactional. It is irrevocable. Outside, reporters gathered. Cameras glowed against the glass entrance. Microphones awaited statements no one wanted to give. The company's downfall was no longer an internal crisis. It was public theater. And the CEO was the unwilling star of a performance he never rehearsed for. Inside, the boardroom shifted. Chairs were straightened. Files were opened. Board members entered, not to strategize, but to judge. They came not with applause, but with verdicts. The CEO realized, finally, that he was no longer leading the company. He was being audited by it. His legacy, once measured in growth, was now measured in disgrace. His decisions were no longer celebrated. They were examined. And when decisions are examined, leaders are exposed. Arrogance had not been his strength. It had been his downfall. He had mistaken applause for approval. He had mistaken silence for loyalty. He had mistaken fear for respect. Now he understood something too late. Respect is earned. Fear expires. And arrogance always sends the bill. He just never expected the price to be everything. The dust of corporate collapse does not settle quietly. It lingers, it stains, and it forces people to confront the truths they once ignored. The morning after the deal fell apart, the company building felt colder, as if the marble floors and glass walls were mourning the reputation they once proudly reflected. The CEO's reserved parking spot sat empty, not because he chose humility, but because he couldn't bring himself to face the army of cameras waiting outside. Overnight, his name transformed from a symbol of leadership into a cautionary tale whispered in corridors. Executives scrambled like ants in a rainstorm. Some tried to rewrite history, claiming they had always questioned the CEO's decisions. Others sought to distance themselves entirely, deleting emails, making urgent phone calls, and begging external consultants for advice. None of their efforts mattered. The world outside had decided its verdict, and no boardroom maneuver could alter it. While the upper floors panicked, something unusual happened on mine. I was no longer invisible. The same employees who once passed me in hallways without a nod now approached me with hesitance, some with gratitude, some with astonishment, others with guilt. A few apologized for laughing the day I had been ordered to fetch coffee, but their apologies were not requests for forgiveness. They were confessions of complicity. The executives who once demanded silence now begged for my time. They scheduled meetings with me, not to offer promotions, but to plead for guidance. They wanted to know what the Japanese delegation had seen that they had missed. They wanted to understand how respect, a word they used in corporate slogans, had somehow become more valuable than projected revenue. I listened, but did not answer immediately. Their desperation revealed something profound. They believed knowledge was transactional. They did not understand that respect is not information, it is behavior. Meanwhile, competitors smelled opportunity. By the second day, my inbox overflowed with offers from rival firms. They did not ask for references. They did not schedule interviews. Instead, they wrote with a clarity my company had never understood. "We want you. Name your price." One company offered double my current salary. Another offered triple. A third sent a detailed proposal with a private office, complete autonomy, and a signing bonus I had to reread twice to believe. Their interest had nothing to do with revenge, sabotage, or gossip. They simply understood that anyone capable of dismantling a lie could be trusted to build truth. For the first time in my career, I realized something liberating. Value is not determined by titles. Titles are printed. Value is recognized. But the greatest surprise did not come from competitors. It came from the Japanese delegation. 3 days after the collapse, I received a discreet message requesting a private conversation. It was not sent to my corporate email. It was sent directly to me, without intermediaries, without pretense. When we met, they bowed, not deeply, but sincerely. Their gestures conveyed something my company never managed to articulate: respect without agenda. They were not interested in resuscitating the deal. They were not interested in using me as a pawn against my former employer. They wanted something far more meaningful, a partnership built not on economic projections, but on shared values. Their lead negotiator explained their perspective with a simplicity that made me wonder how the executives in my old company never understood it. In business, he said, numbers are temporary. Character is permanent. We do not invest in markets. We invest in people. He paused, letting silence reinforce the thought before continuing. You protected dignity at a cost. People who protect dignity protect futures. In that moment, I understood something I had not grasped even while standing in that conference room. The delegation did not walk away because of mistranslations or bad projections. They walked away because the company had tried to build wealth on a foundation of contempt. It wasn't the numbers that failed. It was the philosophy. The negotiator handed me a document, not a contract, but a blueprint. It outlined a joint venture, not between corporations, but between individuals who believed integrity was not an obstacle to profit, but a prerequisite for it. They did not ask for immediate decisions. They did not pressure me. They simply offered the one thing no one at my former company had ever offered: possibility. After the meeting, I sat in my small apartment and stared at the blueprint. I felt something unusual, not pride, not relief, but clarity. Revenge had never been my intention. Revenge is loud. Truth is quiet. And truth had already done its work. I did not seek vengeance. I did not need it. Revenge requires energy. Consequences require nothing. The CEO taught himself the lesson. I merely opened the curtains. As the days unfolded, the company continued to implode. The board removed him from his position, citing strategic misalignment. He tried to issue statements implying he was stepping down voluntarily, but no one believed him. He did not retire. He retreated. He did not resign. He evaporated.